The garden party at the vicarage was the most anticipated event of the summer in Chipping Cleghorn, that charming corner of England where time seemed to dawdle and the roses bloomed in defiance of the modern age. The bunting was strung neatly. Between the sycamore trees, the vicar's wife had arranged the cake table with military precision, and the local children were released in waves to chase hoops and butterflies over the lawn. Miss Jane Marple, spinster of St. Mary Mead and temporary guest of her old school friend, Mrs. Amelia Hartnell, sat modestly in a striped canvas chair beneath a white parasol, knitting a new tea cosy and watching the scene with eyes far sharper than her manner suggested. "It's all gone off splendidly, hasn't it?" chirped Mrs. Hartnell, brushing imaginary crumbs from her lap. "A good turnout. Even Colonel Proudfoot made an appearance, and he hasn't been seen in public since the council paved over his cricket pitch." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, but did not look up from her needles. There were cakes and cream buns, white-gloved ladies discussing rhubarb and relatives, and the vicar chuckling rather too heartily with the new schoolmistress, Miss Lydia Penn. No one at that moment suspected that death was in attendance too, hidden like a spider behind the hydrangeas. It was shortly after 4 o'clock when the scream came, sharp, high, and female. A silence fell across the garden, as if even the bees had paused. Then came the rush of feet. It was Dora Fanshawe, a local seamstress with a fondness for lavender water and strong tea. She stood on the back steps of the vicarage, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing wordlessly toward the sitting room. Mr. Denning, the village solicitor, was first to enter. Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat and followed at a gentler pace, unnoticed in the flurry. Inside the sitting room, the sunshine no longer seemed so golden. Laid awkwardly across the plush hearth rug was the body of Simon Blackwell, a guest, from London and brother-in-law to the vicar's wife. His face was pale, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and one arm was flung toward the fireplace, where the ornamental candlestick, brass, heavy, and curiously clean, lay some inches away. "No blood," murmured Mr. Denning. "But his eyes, good Lord." "He's dead," said Lydia Penn, clutching the back of a chair. "He must have fallen. He looked pale all afternoon." But Miss Marple, now quietly standing near the piano, glanced at the hearth and noticed something quite peculiar. The candlestick, large and ornate, was unmistakably from the pair that usually sat on the mantel. Yet, while one still stood in its usual place, this one lay oddly on the floor, without a candle. She said nothing. "Call the police," the vicar ordered. "No one is to leave the garden." "But Reverend," Mrs. Fanshawe squeaked, "people are already heading home." "Then stop them!" Miss Marple turned away as the room began to buzz again, voices clashing like cymbals. Her blue eyes swept over the guests still loitering outside, the nervous glances, the whispers, the quiet calculations of departure. It was all so very familiar. Mrs. Hartnell came to her side. "Poor Simon. I never liked him, mind you, always. Too sharp-tongued for a house guest. Still, no one deserves to die at a vicarage garden party." Miss Marple made a faint sound of sympathy. And then, almost to herself, she said, "I've always thought that the most revealing thing about a murder isn't the moment it happens, but how people behave when they think no one is watching." Her knitting needles, which had paused mid-stitch, resumed their slow, measured click. The breeze stirred the curtains, and though the village of Chipping Cleghorn had returned to its bustle and chatter, a quiet tension had settled like the echo of thunder on a clear summer day. The arrival of Inspector Crail from Much Benham was neither hurried nor leisurely. He was a man with a reputation for careful thought and a fondness for neat conclusions. He shook hands with the vicar, nodded respectfully to Mrs. Blackwell, still pale but stoic, and then cast a quick glance at the body before ordering the room to be cleared. Miss Marple did not intrude. She remained in the garden, feigning interest, in a plate of seed cake, her ears keen for snatches of conversation and her eyes watchful. The vicar's wife had taken charge of seating the guests who remained. Most were murmuring reassurances to one another, with the anxious energy of people who had witnessed a death but were unsure whether to feel scandalized or inconvenienced. "I dare say it was natural causes," opined Miss Grimley, the retired headmistress. "He had the look of a man with a weak constitution, pasty, nervous hands. No doubt an attack of the heart." "Don't be silly, Ada," replied Major Rendell, scowling over the rim of his brandy flask. "I saw the angle of that neck. No man does that to himself unless he's been dropped from a height, or knocked like a ninepin with something weighty. And yet there was no blood," muttered Mrs. Hartnell, sitting stiffly beside Miss Marple. "You'd think, wouldn't you, with all the excitement, someone would have noticed if he'd screamed." "He wouldn't have had time," said Miss Marple quietly. "If it was a blow to the back of the head, as it appeared, death would have been immediate. The candlestick, if I'm not mistaken, had been moved quite deliberately. Did you notice there was no candle in it?" Mrs. Hartnell blinked. "I thought the wind had blown it out earlier." "But both candlesticks should have had candles," Miss Marple said gently. "I noticed them when I was in the drawing-room before tea, and the one on the mantel still had its stub." Mrs. Hartnell fell silent, her face puckering with thought. The drawing-room, Inspector Crail stood by the fireplace, arms folded, eyes sweeping from rug to ceiling. The candlestick had been collected and placed on a handkerchief atop the sideboard. Dr. Pendry had confirmed the death as almost certainly instantaneous. "No sign of forced entry," Crail murmured. "No struggle. The body was discovered by the housemaid, Dora Fanshawe. And what was Mr. Blackwell doing in here alone?" The vicar shifted uncomfortably. "He said he needed to telephone his club in London, something about a wire he hadn't received." "Did he make the call?" I don't know. The telephone was off the hook when I looked just now, but whether he used it or not." "And where were you at the time?" "In the garden, of course, with the others." "Not the whole time, Reverend." The vicar flushed. "Well, no. I went in briefly to fetch more lemonade from the pantry, but I didn't go into the drawing-room." "Did anyone?" There was a pause, and then Mrs. Blackwell's voice, quiet but firm, floated from behind him. "Lydia Penn, the school-teacher. I saw her heading toward the back corridor just after Simon excused himself. I thought it odd at the time." "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell," Crail said, scribbling in his notepad. "Very helpful." Outside, Lydia Penn had resumed her post, near the lemonade table. Her face was composed, though her hands tugged at the lace cuffs of her blouse. When Crail summoned her, she followed him into the house without question, but Miss Marple noted the brief exchange of glances between her and Colonel Proudfoot, an odd moment of shared recognition, quickly masked. Back inside, Crail's questioning was brisk. "I understand you went into the house around the time Mr. Blackwell died." "Yes," Lydia said. "I had a letter in my bag that needed posting urgently. I meant to leave it with the housekeeper so it could go with the vicar's afternoon post." "Did you see Mr. Blackwell?" "No." "Did you hear anything?" "Fall. A cry?" "Nothing." I walked to the back hall, left the letter in the silver tray on the bureau, and returned to the garden. It couldn't have taken more than 3 minutes. Inspector Crail gave her a long look. "You seem very certain." "I have a good sense of time, Inspector. I'm a teacher." Outside, Miss Marple sipped her tea. People came and went from the vicarage in subdued clusters. Dr. Pendry had taken the body away, and murmurs of "so sudden and terribly sad" were already being woven into the town's gossip tapestry. Miss Marple, however, remained still, her knitting untouched in her lap. Her thoughts circled back to Simon Blackwell, an arrogant man, by most accounts. Not well liked, certainly. A financier newly returned from Canada and rumoured to be pressing his sister for a loan to get back on his feet. He had not seemed the sort to make friends easily. "He argued with someone last night," said Mrs. Hartnell suddenly, breaking the silence. I heard raised voices from the guest bedroom. Amelia tried to hush me, but I distinctly heard the words, "over my dead body." Rather theatrical, I thought. Who was he arguing with? I couldn't say, but I know it wasn't Amelia. She had gone to bed early. Her sinuses again. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The words, "over my dead body," had a ring of melodrama, but in her experience, people who use such phrases rarely meant them, unless they were cornered, desperate, or afraid. Inspector Crail soon returned to the garden, his notepad now considerably fuller. He addressed the remaining guests with an air of wearied authority. "We are treating this as a suspicious death. I ask that no one leave the village until we have completed our inquiries. If you saw anything unusual today, anything at all, you must speak with me or Constable Perry." There were polite murmurs and nods, but several faces paled. Miss Marple noticed especially how Colonel Proudfoot's jaw tightened. His military posture had stiffened further since the announcement. When the garden began to empty, Miss Marple rose slowly and walked toward the vicarage, pretending to examine the begonias flanking the path. Near the edge of the porch, she paused and stooped. A pale scrap of paper caught in the low hedge trembled in the breeze. She plucked it carefully and read the few words inked on it. "He knows. We must speak tonight. By the sundial. J." She turned the slip over. It was torn, uneven, at the top as if hastily ripped from a notebook or diary. No address, no signature beyond the initial. Miss Marple folded the scrap neatly and tucked it into her sleeve. She did not show it to Inspector Crail, not yet. She was not quite ready to be dismissed as a fussy old woman who had wandered too, close to the edges of a case. Instead, she returned to her seat and resumed her knitting, though her mind was far from idle. Someone in that garden had sent that note. Someone whose secret had now turned deadly, and though the candlestick no longer held a candle, it had most certainly held the truth. Only now, it was Miss Marple's quiet mission to draw it into the light. The evening settled over Chipping Cleghorn like a soft, cool blanket. But beneath its calm surface, the village was restless. Lights flickered in the windows of cottages and the vicarage alike. Yet the cheerful murmur of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a tense quiet. Shadows lengthened, and the faint scent of wet earth mingled with the smoke of chimney fires, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Inside the vicarage, the drawing-room had been cleared and tidied with care, but the memory of the day's tragedy lingered like a stain. The heavy brass candlestick, now carefully wrapped in white tissue, rested on the mantelpiece, conspicuously out of place. The police had finished their initial inquiries and were preparing to take statements. Inspector Crail was seated at the heavy oak table, his expression serious but measured. Miss Marple, who had been lingering nearby in her usual unassuming manner, was invited to sit and recount what she had seen and heard. She obliged, choosing her words with precision, careful not to reveal the sharpness of her deductions, allowing instead her natural air of gentle curiosity to guide the conversation. "Mr. Blackwell was an unsettling man, was he not?" she ventured softly. "A stranger to our village, yes, but with old ties through family. I heard he was pressing his sister for money." "Indeed," the vicar admitted, eyes clouded with worry. "A difficult man. Not one to make friends easily, as you say. But I never imagined anyone would wish him harm." Crail nodded. "We all have secrets, Reverend, and it's often the secrets that lead to unfortunate ends." He glanced at Miss Marple with a slight smile. "You mentioned a missing candle from the candlestick?" "Yes," she replied. "Both candlesticks were there in the afternoon, each with a candle, but the one found near the body was empty. It's a small detail, perhaps insignificant, but it struck me as odd. Why remove the candle?" Inspector Crail tapped his pen thoughtfully. "We will have the objects examined, of course, but tell me, Miss Marple, Did anything else stand out? To you? Any small things that others might have overlooked? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled faintly. The note, Inspector. I found it outside near the hedge. A message unsigned, with only the initial J. It spoke of knowledge and a meeting by the sundial this evening. Crale's brow furrowed. A meeting? This very night? Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. I intend to be there. The vicar looked alarmed. Miss Marple, surely you don't think it's safe? She smiled kindly. The sundial is in full view of the main road and the neighbouring gardens. I shall be discreet. As the room emptied and the evening deepened, Miss Marple prepared for her quiet vigil. Wrapped in her shawl, she stepped into the fading light and made her way toward the village green where the sundial stood, an ancient stone fixture surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and blooming lavender. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp grass. The village seemed oddly deserted for this time of day. Even the usually lively pub appeared closed early, windows shuttered. Miss Marple settled onto a bench near the sundial, her knitting laid aside, her eyes alert beneath the soft brim of her hat. Minutes passed, each one measured and slow. Then, from the shadow of an elm tree, a figure approached, a tall, slender man dressed in a dark overcoat, his hat pulled low against the chill. "Good evening," Miss Marple said softly, rising to greet him. The man hesitated, then bowed slightly. "Miss Marple, I presume. I'm Jonathan Smythe." She nodded. "You sent the note?" "Yes. I didn't know whom else to trust." His voice was low, almost hurried. "Simon was my cousin and we shared certain concerns." Miss Marple gestured toward the sundial. "Walk with me." They moved slowly, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. Jonathan Smythe's eyes darted nervously. Simon had enemies, more than one. In London, yes, but also here. There are things the village doesn't know, old grudges and recent disputes. "Such as?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Financial troubles, family disputes, and a matter of inheritance," he said, voice dropping further. Simon had discovered something about the vicar's late father's estate, something he believed could change his fortune. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And did he share this discovery with anyone?" "Only me. I was supposed to meet him tonight to discuss it further. Yet he never made it." "No," Jonathan admitted, "and now I fear for my own safety." A sudden noise behind them, a rustle in the bushes, made them both turn sharply. A figure slipped past the hedge and disappeared down the lane before Miss Marple could speak. Jonathan looked shaken. "Did you see that?" "Yes," she said quietly. "We must be cautious. Secrets in this village have teeth." Later, back at the vicarage, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Guests who had lingered to offer condolences now whispered furtively, in corners. Among them was Colonel Proudfoot, his face set in a hard line, and Mrs. Fanshawe, the housemaid, whose hands trembled as she poured tea. Miss Marple observed them closely. The Colonel avoided eye contact and spoke only when spoken to, his military bearing barely masking a restlessness. Mrs. Fanshawe seemed distracted, casting quick glances toward the garden door as if expecting someone to enter. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the missing candle and the candlestick. It was a seemingly trivial detail, yet its removal hinted at intention, perhaps to conceal fingerprints or to mislead. She recalled also the argument Mrs. Hartnell overheard and the suspicious movements of Lydia Penn. The police continued their work, interviewing each guest and staff member in turn. Miss Marple listened carefully, piecing together their stories. Like threads in a tapestry, she noted inconsistencies, small slips in time, vague references to places and people, and the nervous avoidance of certain topics. When Inspector Crale sought her opinion, she offered nothing conclusive but suggested the need for patience. truth," she said softly, "is like a candle flame. It may flicker and waver, but with care, it will illuminate even the darkest corners." That night, as the village fell into restless sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window, the scrap of paper with the cryptic note folded in her hand. She understood that the key to Simon Blackwell's death lay not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments and whispered fears. And as dawn approached, she resolved to watch closely, to listen to the village's secrets, to observe the shadows behind polite smiles, and to let human nature guide her to the truth hidden within the candlestick that held no candle. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows and the neatly tended gardens of Chipping Cleghorn, wrapping the village in a soft, silvery haze that blurred the edges of familiar shapes. As the sun slowly climbed above the distant hills, its light began to scatter through the vale, casting a pale glow over the streets where the day's business awaited. But the village still wore a somber expression. The murder of Simon Blackwell had unsettled the community profoundly, and the ripple of unease persisted like a shadow. Miss Marple emerged from her small cottage, adjusting her shawl against the lingering chill. She paused a moment at the garden gate, gazing thoughtfully toward the vicarage, where the investigation was clearly in full swing. She had spent the early hours reflecting on the conversations of the previous day and night, especially her meeting with Jonathan Smythe. His warning and the mysterious note with the single initial J pressed at her mind, demanding attention. The vicarage garden was a place of quiet beauty, and yet it had been the scene of whispered threats and hidden animosities. Miss Marple decided to begin her day by revisiting the spot where Simon had been found. The candlestick, now securely stored by the police, lingered in her thoughts. She had yet to understand why its empty socket was so important, but her instincts told her to be patient. As she walked through the village, the early stirrings of daily life greeted her, Mrs. Ellery arranging fresh blooms in her front window, Mr. Crane tending to his shop, and the schoolchildren trickling down the lane in small clusters. Yet beneath the everyday rhythm, the weight of suspicion hung in the air, palpable in sideways glances and lowered voices. At the vicarage, Inspector Crail was already engaged with the coroner and a few constables. He acknowledged Miss Marple's arrival with a nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple. We're planning to interview the household staff again. There seem to be discrepancies in some of their statements." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Discrepancies often point to the heart of the matter, Inspector." He smiled faintly. "Indeed. Would you care to join us? Your insights have been valuable." She agreed and followed him inside, where the morning light fell softly across the polished wood and the faded floral wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of brewing tea and the faint tang of cleaning products, a small human contrast to the starkness of death. Mrs. Fanshawe, the housemaid, sat nervously in the corner, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. The vicar's wife stood nearby, composed but visibly distressed. One by one, the staff were brought forward, each questioned carefully, the officers watching closely for signs of inconsistency. Miss Marple listened attentively as Mrs. Fanshawe recounted the events of the previous afternoon. "I was in the kitchen, ma'am, when I heard voices raised. I thought it was the vicar and Mr. Blackwell arguing. Then, later, I saw Mr. Blackwell come out to the garden, and that was the last I saw of him." "Did you notice anything unusual about the candlestick, Mrs. Fanshawe?" Miss Marple asked gently. The woman hesitated. "Well, ma'am, I did see the candlestick on the mantelpiece without its candle later that evening. I thought perhaps someone had moved it, or used the candle elsewhere." The inspector made a note. "Did you see who might have taken it?" "No, sir," she replied, her eyes flickering nervously. "But I did see Miss Lydia Penn near the drawing room around that time." The mention of Lydia Penn caused a ripple of interest. Lydia was a young woman who worked as a companion to Mrs. Blackwell. and she had already attracted some suspicion due to her evasive answers earlier. "Miss Marple," Inspector Crail said. "Perhaps you might speak with Miss Penn. She seems to be at the centre of some of these inconsistencies." Miss Marple nodded and made her way to the small sitting room where Lydia Penn was waiting. The young woman looked pale but tried to mask it with a faint smile. Her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Penn," Miss Marple began softly, "I wonder if you might help me understand the events of yesterday. I hear you were near the drawing room at a crucial time." Lydia swallowed hard. I was only there to collect some papers for Mrs. Blackwell. I didn't see anything unusual." "But you were aware of Mr. Blackwell's strained relationship with his sister?" "Yes," Lydia admitted. "They argued often, but I thought it was just family quarrels. I didn't imagine it would lead to something so terrible." Miss Marple observed her quietly. "Sometimes it is the small details we overlook that reveal the most. For example, did you notice the candlestick's missing candle?" Lydia's eyes widened, and she seemed to consider her answer carefully. "I thought it odd, yes, but I didn't want to speak out of turn. Was there anyone else in the house who might have had reason to disturb it?" Lydia hesitated again, then said softly, "The Colonel. He seemed upset yesterday. I heard him mention money matters." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Penn. Please be honest if you remember anything else." Leaving Lydia to her thoughts, Miss Marple returned to the garden where she found Jonathan Smythe waiting, his expression anxious but relieved to see her. "Have you learned anything new?" he asked quickly. "A few more details, yes," she replied. "The candlestick and the missing candle seem more important than they first appeared. I believe someone wanted to remove evidence or perhaps send a message." Jonathan frowned. "Do you think the Colonel could be involved? He had plenty of reasons to dislike Simon." Miss Marple considered this. Colonel Proudfoot was a formidable presence, but she sensed a complexity beneath his stern exterior. "People are seldom what they seem," she said quietly, "and motives can be layered. Let us observe before we judge." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the vicar, who looked troubled but composed. "I have just spoken with the local solicitor," he said. "There is indeed a dispute over the family estate. Some documents were found missing after Simon's arrival. It appears the old balance sheets reveal debts that would impact his inheritance." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Financial troubles often make even the calmest waters turbulent." As the day wore on, the village seemed to close in on itself, each inhabitant guarded and watchful. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught glimpses of whispered exchanges and guarded gestures that suggested deeper undercurrents. That evening, as the sky grew dim and the village lights twinkled faintly, Miss Marple found herself once again at the sundial, waiting silently. The note's promise of a meeting still loomed, and she hoped the truth would soon reveal itself, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet unfolding of human nature. Suddenly, from the shadows emerged a figure, this time not Jonathan Smythe, but someone else entirely, Lydia Penn, clutching a small parcel to her chest, her face pale but determined. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, "there's something you must see. Something I found in Simon's room." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The mystery deepened, but she was ready. The candlestick had indeed cast a long shadow, and she sensed the first flicker of light was about to break through. Lydia's trembling hands extended the small parcel toward Miss Marple as they stepped together beneath the skeletal branches of the old oak tree. The night air was crisp and carried the faint scent of damp earth and blooming late roses from the garden beds. Miss Marple took the parcel carefully, noting the delicate wrapping, an ordinary scrap of paper tied loosely with a faded ribbon. The bundle was small, but seemed weighty in more ways than one. "Where did you find this?" Miss Marple asked softly, unfolding the paper with deliberate care. In Simon's room, Lydia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. After everyone had left for dinner, I went to fetch a handkerchief and noticed the door wasn't quite shut. I thought perhaps he left something behind. Inside, the parcel contained a handful of yellowed papers and a small folded note. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the fragile edges, and she unfolded the note first. The handwriting was hurried, almost illegible, but the words struck her immediately. To Jay, if anything should happen to me, look to the candlestick. The truth lies where no light shines. The cryptic message set Miss Marple's mind racing. She tucked the note carefully into her pocket and spread out the papers on a nearby stone bench. The documents appeared to be old ledger entries and personal correspondences, some bearing the Blackwell family seal. One letter, dated nearly 10 years prior, caught her attention. It was addressed to Simon, signed by his late uncle, and referenced a hidden clause in the family will, something about a secret to be uncovered only by the rightful heir. As she read, Lydia's eyes darted nervously around the darkened garden. "Do you think this explains why someone wanted Simon dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It certainly sheds light on why the candlestick was singled out," Miss Marple answered. "An empty candlestick, no candle, something concealed in plain sight. It may have served as a hiding place or a signal. The village had long been steeped in tradition, and old families often used objects as secret repositories for documents or valuables." Miss Marple recalled other cases where seemingly mundane household items held the key to unraveling a mystery. "Tell me, Lydia," she said gently. "Do you remember seeing the candlestick before the murder? Was it always empty, or did it usually hold a candle?" Lydia frowned, thinking back. "I'm not sure. I never paid much attention to it, but now that I recall, there was always a candle in it when I arrived last year." That detail was significant. It implied that the candle had been removed deliberately, perhaps to conceal something within the hollow shaft. Miss Marple felt a thrill of anticipation, but also caution. The next steps must be taken carefully. As they spoke, the soft crunch of footsteps approached. Miss Marple looked up to see Inspector Crail and a constable making their way toward them. The inspector's sharp eyes took in the parcel and the scattered papers. "Miss Marple, Miss Penn," he said briskly. "We've been searching Simon's room again. There's been a development." "Do tell," Miss Marple said, folding the papers neatly. "We found traces of a substance on the underside of the candlestick base, something like a thin smear of wax, but it's mixed with dirt and a faint reddish stain. It may be a clue we overlooked." The inspector's voice was thoughtful. Miss Marple nodded. "The candlestick's role in this mystery is more complex than a mere weapon or ornament. It may have concealed the secret mentioned in that note." "Have you any idea what the reddish stain could be?" Lydia asked. "It's too early to say," the inspector replied. "We'll send it for analysis, but meanwhile, the search continues. We're focusing on possible hiding places in the house and grounds." Miss Marple glanced once more at the garden's shadows, where every corner now seemed to hide potential secrets. The atmosphere was taut with anticipation. The village, so accustomed to peaceful days and quiet routines, had become a stage for hidden resentments and desperate acts. That night, as Miss Marple settled by her fireplace with a steaming cup of tea, her thoughts turned to the people she had met, the Colonel, whose stern demeanour masked a troubled past, Lydia, whose nervous honesty hinted at deeper involvement, Jonathan Smythe, the earnest solicitor with a protective streak, and the vicar, caught between his pastoral duties and family loyalties. Each had motives and secrets, each carried pieces of the puzzle that, when combined, would reveal the true face of the crime. Her eyes fell again on the note she had slipped into her pocket. The phrase, "where no light shines," was more than metaphorical. It was a literal clue. The empty candlestick was not just a symbol of darkness, but possibly a container for something the killer sought to hide or destroy. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the Blackwell estate once more. The air was brisk and the sky was painted with pale strokes of dawn. She made her way to the drawing room where the candlestick had been displayed, now secured in a glass case at the request of the police. Standing before it, she peered closely at its base. The hollow metal cylinder had a subtle seam that suggested it could be opened, a compartment disguised as part of the design. "Miss Marple," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Colonel Proudfoot standing nearby, his expression unreadable. "I heard you were inspecting the candlestick again," he said. "I hope you don't mind, but I have something to add." She gestured for him to continue. "There was talk among the servants that the candlestick once belonged to a distant relative who was something of an eccentric collector," he explained. "Apparently he had a habit of hiding documents or small valuables inside objects, just as you suggested." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "That fits perfectly. Do you know where he kept his collection, or if there were other such items?" The colonel shook his head. "Not exactly. The family history is patchy, but some items were rumored to be dispersed after his death." As they spoke, Lydia approached. From the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "Miss Marple, I found something else." She held out a small, worn leather pouch. Inside were 2 keys, one old and rusted, the other newer but equally weathered. Miss Marple took them with a smile. "Just when I thought this mystery couldn't grow more intricate." Together, they examined the candlestick again, testing the fit of the keys in the base. The older key slid in smoothly, and with a faint click, a hidden compartment sprung open, revealing a folded piece of parchment carefully preserved inside. Unfolding it, Miss Marple read aloud, "To whoever finds this, know that the truth about the Blackwell estate lies buried beneath the sundial in the garden. Beware those who seek to keep it hidden." A shiver ran through the group. The mystery was no longer confined to the house, but spread into the garden itself, the very place where Simon's body had been discovered. Miss Marple's mind raced. The sundial, the candlestick, the missing candle, all connected in a web of secrets and deception. The killer's attempt to conceal the truth had only deepened the intrigue. "We must search beneath the sundial," Miss Marple declared. "But with care. Whoever left this message wanted it found, yet feared discovery." The colonel nodded grimly. "I'll see to it that the garden is secured." As the day wore on, the villagers gathered uneasily, their curiosity piqued by the renewed investigation. Miss Marple knew that each new revelation stirred old wounds and that the killer might yet try to cover their tracks. But the detective's patient eyes saw through the layers of pretense. In the quiet of the garden, beneath the sundial's shadow, the final pieces of the puzzle awaited, and the truth was ready to emerge from the darkness where no light had shone before. Miss Marple stood quietly by the sundial as the gardeners carefully cleared the area around its stone base. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the garden, neighbors, curious and anxious, whispering theories as the police oversaw the delicate excavation. The detective's gaze drifted across the assembled faces, each marked by a mixture of curiosity and unease. It was clear that the murder had unearthed more than just a body. It had shaken the very foundations of the village's seemingly placid existence. As a gardener pried loose a loose flagstone beside the sundial, Inspector Crail beckoned Miss Marple over. "Look here," he said, pointing to the exposed earth beneath the stone. "There's a small metal box embedded in the soil. We'll have it out in a moment." Miss Marple knelt beside the hole, her eyes narrowing as the box was carefully lifted free and wiped clean. It was an unassuming tin, corroded by years underground, yet the faint glint of a lock caught the sunlight. "Another secret hidden away," she murmured, her fingers deftly examining the box's surface. "This is where the family's past truly lies." Inspector Crail produced a small set of tools and soon popped the lid open. Inside lay a bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon, and a tarnished silver locket. Miss Marple carefully untied the bundle, her heart quickening with anticipation. The papers revealed a series of letters and a diary belonging to a woman named Eleanor Blackwell, Simon's great-aunt, whose existence had been a whispered rumour in village gossip but little more. Eleanor's writings spoke of betrayals, secret romances, and disputes over the estate, painful memories long buried and now resurrected. One letter in particular caught Miss Marple's attention. It was addressed to Eleanor from a mysterious correspondent, warning her to keep silent about a scandal that could ruin the family name. The tone was threatening, the handwriting shaky yet insistent. The locket, too, held its own secret. Inside was a faded photograph of Eleanor, alongside a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to Colonel Proudfoot. "Look here," Miss Marple said, holding the locket aloft. "It seems the Colonel's connection to the family runs deeper than anyone suspected." The Colonel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple sensed the tension radiating from him, a mixture of guilt and protective resolve. "We must share these findings with the others," the inspector said, rising. "There's more here than simple greed or rivalry." As the box was bagged as evidence, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. Eleanor's words revealed a pattern of hidden resentments and concealed motives. The village's polite veneer had masked passions and fears that now threatened to boil over. Later that evening, Miss Marple invited Lydia and Jonathan to her cottage for tea. The flickering firelight painted soft shadows on the walls as they settled in, the atmosphere intimate yet charged with unspoken questions. "Eleanor Blackwell's diary speaks of a dark chapter," Miss Marple began gently. "A scandal so severe it must have cast a long shadow over this family." Lydia glanced away, biting her lip. "There was always talk about her. People said she vanished suddenly, that she was shunned." Jonathan nodded. "And yet no one ever truly looked into it. Perhaps they feared what they might find." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Secrets such as these fester over time, and when the past is disturbed, the repercussions can be deadly." They discussed Eleanor's relationship with the Colonel, the mysterious correspondence threats, and the potential impact on Simon's inheritance. It became clear that the family feud had roots far deeper than Simon's disputes over property. "Do you think Simon uncovered something in Eleanor's papers that sealed his fate?" Lydia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a distinct possibility," Miss Marple replied. "And whoever wished to keep those secrets buried may have acted with desperation." As the evening wore on, Miss Marple noticed subtle shifts in Lydia's demeanour, the way her hands trembled slightly as she refilled her cup, the guarded way she answered questions. There was more beneath the surface, layers of fear and hesitation. Later, when Jonathan had gone home, Lydia confided in Miss Marple quietly, "I wanted to tell you something earlier, but I was afraid." The detective leaned forward, her eyes kind, yet probing. "You can trust me." Lydia hesitated, then whispered, "I saw someone near the sundial the night Simon was killed. It was after the party ended, late and dark. I didn't recognize the figure clearly, just a shadow moving quickly. I didn't say anything because I was frightened." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was a new lead, one that might unravel the tangled threads of the case. "Did you see where the figure went?" Miss Marple asked. "No, it was too dark, but it moved toward the old shed by the garden's edge." The detective nodded slowly. "We must visit this shed tomorrow. The truth often hides in the most overlooked places." The night deepened, and Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the village's lights flicker and fade. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, one of betrayal, hidden desires, and long-held grudges. She reflected on the candlestick that held no candle, the sundial's secret compartment, and now Eleanor Blackwell's revelations. Each clue was a step closer to uncovering the murderer's identity. But Miss Marple knew better than to rush. The killer was still among them, watching, waiting. It was a game of patience, observation, and careful deduction. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, but tonight the village lay silent, holding its breath as the shadows lengthened and the mystery deepened. The morning air was crisp with the lingering chill of dawn as Miss Marple and Inspector Crail made their way toward the old garden shed. The dew sparkled on the grass, and the village stirred slowly to life, unaware of the quiet urgency that propelled the two investigators through the hedgerows and past blooming foxgloves. The shed stood at the edge of the property, a weathered, wooden structure, its paint peeling and its windows dusty. The garden's charm gave way here to neglect, as if this corner of the grounds had been deliberately abandoned, a place for forgotten things. Miss Marple's eyes took in every detail, the slight tilt of the door, the faint footprints pressed into the soft earth beneath the threshold. Inspector Crail jiggled the rusted handle. "Locked," he muttered, producing a set of keys he'd borrowed from Simon's study. With a soft click, the door creaked open, releasing a faint, musty scent. Inside, the dim interior revealed stacks of garden tools, flower pots, and a cluttered workbench. But what caught Miss Marple's attention immediately was a large, overturned crate resting near the far wall. She stepped carefully, her footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug. The crate, once opened, revealed a jumble of letters and papers, some damp and yellowed by time, others surprisingly fresh. Miss Marple's fingers brushed aside the layers until she found a small leather-bound notebook, its edges worn but its pages intact. "More secrets," she murmured, flipping through the entries. The handwriting was hurried and uneven, as if penned in moments of distress. The notebook belonged to Simon himself. The pages detailed a series of observations, suspicions, and veiled accusations aimed at various villagers. There were notes about overheard conversations, odd behaviors, and references to hidden debts and secret meetings. Simon had clearly been trying to unravel a web of deceit, sensing danger closing in. Inspector Crail frowned. He was onto something, wasn't he? Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. He sensed the currents beneath the calm surface, but what troubled him most was a mention of the candlestick that held no candle. It seems that phrase had a significance far beyond the object itself. They examined the shed further and found a small, broken box concealed beneath the floorboards. Inside, several silver spoons and a single faded photograph of a young woman in a garden. Her eyes, calm yet knowing, seemed to watch them silently. "Is she Eleanor Blackwell?" the inspector asked. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "And it seems Eleanor's story intertwines with Simon's in ways that have yet to be fully revealed." Returning to the village, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Dalloway, the housekeeper who had served the Blackwell family for decades. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared tea, but her eyes were sharp and guarded. "Mrs. Dalloway," Miss Marple began gently, "could you tell me more about Eleanor Blackwell? What was her story as you knew it?" The woman sighed, a shadow crossing her face. Miss Eleanor was a bright soul, ahead of her time. She loved this village but was shunned after a scandal many preferred to forget. There were whispers about her relationship with Colonel Proudfoot. Some said it was more than friendship. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And the Colonel? Was he aware of Eleanor's feelings?" Mrs. Dalloway hesitated. He cared for her in his own way, but duty and reputation held him back. When Eleanor threatened to expose certain truths, things turned sour. She left suddenly, but not before leaving behind clues that only the most observant could piece together. The detective smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalloway. Your memories are invaluable." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a discreet gathering at the village hall under the pretense of discussing the upcoming summer festival. As neighbours arrived, whispers and sideways glances filled the room, but Miss Marple's calm presence seemed to quiet the undercurrent of suspicion. She began by sharing stories of Eleanor's time in the village, her kindness, her isolation, and the mystery surrounding her departure. Slowly, villagers opened up, revealing fragments of old rivalries and resentments that had simmered just beneath the surface. Jonathan Blackwell, looking weary but resolute, stepped forward. Eleanor's departure changed everything. She held secrets that could have undone the family, and Simon's discovery of her diary must have stirred old ghosts. Miss Marple nodded. Secrets have a way of clawing their way back into the light, especially when the wrong hands seek to keep them hidden. A murmur swept through the room as Lydia shifted uneasily, her eyes darting toward the colonel, who stood stiffly near the back. Suddenly the village doctor, Dr. Langley, raised a hand. "There's something else. I was called to Simon's home. The night of the party. He was anxious, frightened even. He mentioned seeing someone lurking near the garden shed." "Did he say who it was?" Miss Marple asked. "No, but he described a figure cloaked in shadows, moving swiftly and deliberately," the doctor replied. "He seemed certain they wanted to find something he was hiding." Miss Marple's mind raced. The shed, Eleanor's, secrets, the mysterious visitor, threads weaving into a tapestry she was only beginning to comprehend. That evening, as the village retired, a sudden knock at Miss Marple's door interrupted the quiet. It was Lydia, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "I couldn't keep this to myself," Lydia whispered. "There's more to the story than anyone knows. I overheard a conversation between Colonel Proudfoot and someone else. They spoke of silencing Simon, of protecting the family name at any cost." Miss Marple motioned her inside, her own heart quickening. The game was far from over. Shadows lengthened once more, and the village held its breath, caught in the silent, deadly dance of secrets and lies. That night, the village seemed to hold its breath, shadows cast long by the flickering gas lamps, and an uneasy silence settled over the cobblestone streets. In the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, Lydia's revelation turning over in her mind like a puzzle piece, slipping just slightly out of place. The weight of unspoken fears and half-truths pressed upon her. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth steady her thoughts. The next morning, the soft murmur of village life resumed, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak directly with Colonel Proudfoot. The old soldier had remained a figure of stoic reserve since Simon's death, yet the whispered accusations and Lydia's fearful confession could not be ignored. It was essential to understand his role in this tangled web. The colonel's home, a stately manor on the outskirts of the village, stood grim and silent under a grey sky. The garden was neat but devoid of the warmth one might expect from a place once shared with Eleanor. Miss Marple was shown into a drawing-room where the colonel sat, eyes sharp and expression unreadable. "Colonel Proudfoot," she began gently, "I hope you will forgive my intrusion, but there are questions that need answering. Questions about Simon and the troubles that surrounded him in recent weeks." The colonel inclined his head, his voice steady but cautious. "Miss Marple, I understand your concern. Simon was a good man, but these days goodness often walks a precarious path," she continued. "There are whispers, Colonel, that you wished to protect the Blackwell family name, even at great cost, that you feared what Simon might reveal." For a moment the colonel's eyes flickered, betraying a shadow of pain. "I cared for Eleanor more than most knew. Her departure left wounds that time has not fully healed. As for Simon, he was determined. To uncover truths best left buried, I sought only to prevent further harm. Miss Marple pressed gently. And what of the phrase, the candlestick that held no candle? Simon seemed convinced it was key to understanding the danger he faced. The Colonel's expression darkened. A symbol of deceit, Miss Marple. A candlestick without a candle is a promise unfulfilled, a trust broken. Eleanor used that phrase to warn of betrayal. Simon found it in her diary, and it became his obsession. Leaving the manor, Miss Marple's mind raced. The candlestick was more than an object. It was a metaphor for the fractured loyalties and hidden betrayals within the village. But who wielded this betrayal as a weapon, and why? Returning to the village, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Dalloway once more. The housekeeper's face was drawn with worry, yet she welcomed Miss Marple's presence as a balm. "Mrs. Dalloway," she began, "do you know if Eleanor left any other clues? Perhaps something hidden where only she and Simon might have looked?" Mrs. Dalloway hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was a locket Eleanor wore, with a tiny compartment inside. She told me it held a secret she could never share aloud. After she left, it was lost, or so we thought." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "And might it be hidden somewhere in the house or grounds? I believe it might be in the old library. Eleanor was fond of that room, especially the hidden alcove behind the bookcase." With a grateful nod, Miss Marple hurried to the Blackwell Estates library. The room smelled of leather and dust, a sanctuary of faded grandeur. She searched until her fingers found the edges of a secret panel behind the rows of books. The panel gave way to reveal a small carved box. Inside lay the locket, delicate and tarnished, yet unmistakably precious. Carefully, Miss Marple opened it, revealing a folded note, its edges brittle but the ink still legible. The note was brief but chilling. "Trust no one. The candlestick will reveal the truth, but beware the hand that lights it." Her heart quickened. The message confirmed what she suspected. The candlestick was a symbol used deliberately to warn of danger, but someone had manipulated its meaning to mask their own guilt. The village seemed to shrink around her, its facades of civility cracking to reveal the roiling secrets beneath. Miss Marple knew the next step was to observe carefully the reactions of those closest to the truth. The subtle shifts in manner and speech would betray more than words ever could. That afternoon, the village square buzzed with the usual market chatter, but Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on the faces around her. She watched Lydia carefully, noting the flicker of relief that crossed her features when she spotted the detective. Nearby, Jonathan Blackwell spoke quietly with the Colonel, their tones low and guarded. Miss Marple approached Jonathan, her demeanor light and conversational. "Mr. Blackwell, I wonder, how did your family react to Eleanor's departure? Such an event often leaves more than just memories behind." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It fractured us in ways we're still coming to terms with. There were accusations, silences, and a great deal of fear. Eleanor held truths that challenged the very foundation of our legacy." "And Simon?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Was he prepared for what he might find?" "He believed he was," Jonathan replied. "But sometimes believing is not enough. The past is a weight that can crush the strongest among us." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts swirling. The village was a tapestry of old grievances and hidden fears, woven tightly with threads of loyalty and betrayal. Each person held a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the locket and note secure in her hand. She felt the pull of the unseen forces at work, whispers in the dark, eyes watching from shadows. The real game had begun, and the candlestick's light, whether illuminating or blinding, would soon cast its final glow on the truth. The village waited, breath held, as the detective prepared to draw the tangled strands of suspicion into a single, undeniable thread. The early morning mist curled over the village like a thin veil, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows, yet unable to hide the tension that had settled like a second skin over St. Mary's in the Wood. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, the locket's secret message turning endlessly in her mind. The cryptic warning and the candlestick's symbolic weight were not mere curiosities. They were the key to unveiling the true nature of the darkness that had invaded this quiet place. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his face drawn and his manner unusually cautious. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I've come to discuss a development that might interest you." "Please do come in," she invited, leading him into the sitting room. The inspector wasted no time. "Last night, during our checks, we discovered something odd in the Blackwell Estate storage room. A candlestick, identical to the one Simon was found with. But this one had never held a candle. It was pristine, untouched by soot or wax." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "An empty candlestick, then, just as the phrase suggests. And no candle. The symbol of a promise unfulfilled, a trust broken." Craddock sighed. "Exactly. The discovery raises questions about the real purpose of the object. We found it hidden behind a loose panel in the storage room. Someone went to great lengths to conceal it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And have you any suspects for who might have placed it there?" The inspector shook his head. "No, but the presence of two identical candlesticks is troubling. It suggests deception, a deliberate attempt to mislead." "Or perhaps a signal," Miss Marple mused, "to those who know the meaning. The candlestick without a candle could be a message, not just a weapon." Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "Indeed. There's more. Lydia has agreed to speak with us again. She seemed unsettled after our last meeting. I think she may have information she withheld out of fear." "Then we must listen carefully," Miss Marple said. "Fear is often the shroud around the truth, but once lifted, it reveals everything." The two left together for the village inn, where Lydia had requested to meet discreetly. The room was quiet, a few locals casting curious glances, but Lydia appeared resolute, though her hands trembled slightly as she sat down. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "There's something I didn't say before, something I was too afraid to admit." Miss Marple leaned forward, encouraging without pressing. "What is it, Lydia?" She took a deep breath. "Simon discovered letters. Letters between Eleanor and someone from outside the village. They spoke in code, referencing the candlestick. Eleanor believed this person was dangerous, someone who could ruin everything." "Did she say who?" Craddock asked. Lydia shook her head. "No names, only warnings. She feared betrayal from within and threats from without. She left clues in the diary and the locket to protect Simon." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "This stranger. Did Eleanor ever meet them here?" "Once," Lydia replied, voice trembling. "She arranged a meeting in the churchyard. Simon planned to confront them but was stopped." "Who stopped him?" Craddock inquired sharply. Lydia looked down, shame and fear mingling in her expression. "I did." Both Miss Marple and the inspector stared at her, surprised. "I didn't want Simon to get hurt," Lydia confessed. "I knew this secret could destroy the village, but I feared the consequences. I begged him to leave it alone." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind raced. Lydia's admission confirmed the presence of a dangerous secret outside the immediate family, but the protective instinct had delayed justice. "Very well," Miss Marple said gently. "Who was this stranger?" "I don't know their true identity," Lydia said, "but Eleanor's last letter mentioned the name Hargrave." The name struck a chord. Miss Marple recalled hearing it from an elderly villager months before, a man who had moved quietly into a neglected cottage on the village's edge, rarely seen but often whispered about. Hargrave. Miss Marple repeated. "We must find this person." The day stretched on with urgency. Miss Marple and Craddock set out to locate Hargrave's cottage. The path wound through tangled hedgerows and overgrown fields until they reached a small, weather-beaten house, its windows curtained and the garden wild. Miss Marple knocked firmly, and after a tense pause, the door creaked open to reveal a man with sharp eyes and an expression that combined wariness with something unreadable. "Mr. Hargrave?" Miss Marple asked calmly. He nodded cautiously. "Yes. What can I do for you?" "We're investigating." "The death of Simon Blackwell," Craddock said plainly. "We understand there were communications between you and Eleanor Blackwell." Miss Marple approached Jonathan, her demeanour light and conversational. "Mr. Blackwell, I wonder, how did your family react to Eleanor's departure? Such an event often leaves more than just memories behind." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It fractured us in ways we're still coming to terms with. There were accusations, silences, and a great deal of fear. Eleanor held truths that challenged the very foundation of our legacy." "And Simon?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Was he prepared for what he might find?" "He believed he was," Jonathan replied. "But sometimes believing is not enough. The past is a weight that can crush the strongest among us." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts swirling. The village was a tapestry of old grievances and hidden fears, woven tightly with threads of loyalty and betrayal. Each person held a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the locket and note secure in her hand. She felt the pull of the unseen forces at work, whispers in the dark, eyes watching from shadows. The real game had begun, and the candlestick's light, whether illuminating or blinding, would soon cast its final glow on the truth. The village waited, breath held, as the detective prepared to draw the tangled strands of suspicion into a single, undeniable thread. The early morning mist curled over the village like a thin veil, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows, yet unable to hide the tension that had settled like a second skin over St. Mary's in the Wood. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, the locket's secret message turning endlessly in her mind. The cryptic warning and the candlestick's symbolic weight were not mere curiosities. They were the key to unveiling the true nature of the darkness that had invaded this quiet place. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his face drawn and his manner unusually cautious. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I've come to discuss a development that might interest you." "Please do come in," she invited, leading him into the sitting room. The inspector wasted no time. "Last night, during our checks, we discovered something odd in the Blackwell Estate's storage room, a candlestick, identical to the one Simon was found with, but this one had never held a candle. It was pristine, untouched by soot or wax." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "An empty candlestick then, just as the phrase suggests. And no candle. The symbol of a promise unfulfilled, a trust broken." Craddock sighed. "Exactly. The discovery raises questions about the real purpose of the object. We found it hidden behind a loose panel in the storage room. Someone went to great lengths to conceal it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And have you any suspects for who might have placed it there?" The inspector shook his head. "No, but the presence of two identical candlesticks is troubling. It suggests deception, a deliberate attempt to mislead. Or perhaps a signal," Miss Marple mused, "to those who know the meaning. The candlestick without a candle could be a message, not just a weapon." Craddock frowned thoughtfully. "Indeed, there's more. Lydia has agreed to speak with us again. She seemed unsettled after our last meeting. I think she may have information." She withheld out of fear. "Then we must listen carefully," Miss Marple said. "Fear is often the shroud around the truth, but once lifted, it reveals everything." The two left together for the village inn, where Lydia had requested to meet discreetly. The room was quiet, a few locals casting curious glances, but Lydia appeared resolute, though her hands trembled slightly as she sat down. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "There's something I didn't say before, something I was too afraid to admit." Miss Marple leaned forward, encouraging without pressing. "What is it, Lydia?" She took a deep breath. Simon discovered letters between Eleanor and someone from outside the village. They spoke in code, referencing the candlestick. Eleanor believed this person was dangerous, someone who could ruin everything. "Did she say who?" Craddock asked. Lydia shook her head. "No names, only warnings. She feared betrayal from within and threats from without. She left clues in the diary and the locket to protect Simon." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "This stranger, did Eleanor ever meet them here?" "Once," Lydia replied, voice trembling. "She arranged a meeting in the churchyard. Simon planned to confront them, but was stopped." "Who stopped him?" Craddock inquired sharply. Lydia looked down, shame and fear mingling in her expression. "I did." Both Miss Marple and the inspector stared at her, surprised. "I didn't want Simon to get hurt," Lydia confessed. "I knew this secret could destroy the village, but I feared the consequences. I begged him to leave it alone." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind raced. Lydia's admission confirmed the presence of a dangerous secret outside the immediate family, but the protective instinct had delayed justice. "Very well," Miss Marple said gently. "Who was this stranger?" "I don't know their true identity," Lydia said, "but Eleanor's last letter mentioned the name Hargrave." The name struck a chord. Miss Marple recalled hearing it from an elderly villager months before, a man who had moved quietly into a neglected cottage on the village's edge, rarely seen but often whispered about. "Hargrave," Miss Marple repeated. "We must find this person." The day stretched on with urgency. Miss Marple and Craddock set out to locate Hargrave's cottage. The path wound through tangled hedgerows and overgrown fields until they reached a small, weather-beaten house. Its windows curtained and the garden wild. Miss Marple knocked firmly, and after a tense pause, the door creaked open to reveal a man with sharp eyes and an expression that combined wariness with something unreadable. "Mr. Hargrave?" Miss Marple asked calmly. He nodded cautiously. "Yes. What can I do for you?" "We're investigating the death of Simon Blackwell," Craddock said plainly. "We understand there were communications between you and Eleanor Blackwell." "To whom it may concern, the truth you seek is buried beneath layers of old grievances and new betrayals. Look where the light should shine, but does not. Trust no one who speaks of candlesticks, but holds no flame. The final answer lies where silence was forced and voices were broken. Beware the quietest among you." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This was no idle warning, it was a challenge. Someone close to the heart of the village and the mystery was sending a message cloaked in shadows. "We must return to the churchyard," she said decisively. It was there Eleanor planned to meet Hargrave, and it must hold more than memories. Craddock nodded, and together they made their way through the misty lanes. The churchyard was deserted, the gravestones standing like silent sentinels under the pale moonlight. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the old stone bench beneath the yew tree, where Lydia had mentioned Eleanor's meeting. Kneeling, she examined the ground carefully. The soil was disturbed, fresh, but carefully covered. She motioned to Craddock, who produced a small spade. Together, they began to dig, uncovering a small, rusted box. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and, surprisingly, a small, intricately carved wooden candlestick, this one complete with a candle, though the wax was long melted, away. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the letters. The handwriting was Eleanor's, and the contents confirmed what Lydia and Hargrave had hinted at. Eleanor had uncovered a scheme involving the sale of village lands and the manipulation of wills. The letters named those involved, prominent figures in the village who had acted in secret to enrich themselves at the expense of the community. This explains the desperation, Craddock said, scanning the letters. Eleanor threatened to expose them all. Precisely, Miss Marple replied, and Simon's murder was meant to silence that threat. But why the candlestick? Craddock asked. It was Eleanor's symbol, Miss Marple explained. A light to illuminate the truth, a beacon for justice. The empty candlestick was a warning, an ominous message to those who dared speak. Whoever killed Simon wanted to extinguish that light. They heard footsteps behind them and turned to see Lydia approaching, her face pale but determined. I have something to confess, she said. I was part of the village council meetings where these schemes were planned. I opposed them, but fear kept me silent. I did not want to lose my place or the respect of my neighbours. Miss Marple regarded her kindly but firmly. The truth often comes at a cost, Lydia, but it is never too late to choose right. As Lydia nodded, the quiet night was shattered by a sudden shout from the edge of the churchyard. All three turned toward the sound and saw a figure running, Hargrave, his face drawn with panic. "They know I've spoken," he gasped. "They'll come for me next." Miss Marple's eyes flashed. "We must act swiftly. The circle of guilt is closing." They hurried back to the village, aware that every step was shadowed by danger. Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, piecing together motives, opportunities, and the tangled web of fear and betrayal. The final confrontation was near. The candlestick's true light would soon reveal the darkness hidden beneath the village's peaceful facade, and justice, however delayed, would be served at last.